everybody. Welcome to this edition of the AFSA Extra Credit Podcast. Listen, folks, I say it all the time that consumer credit is not the sexiest topic on the planet, but the history of consumer credit is the sexiest topic on the planet. So the two of us, before the call, we declared ourselves moderate experts on the history of consumer credit in some way. I kid, we are not. But I'm joined by Eric J. Ellman, president of NCRA. Eric, you give it to me.
All right. Good afternoon, Dan, and thank you so much for having me. It is the National Consumer Reporting Association, NCRA.
NCRA, yes. Thank you so much for joining us. This is funny. It came up via email with AFSA President and CEO Celia Winslow, friend of yours, good friend of the podcast, good friend of mine, particularly on the 15th and the last day of the month. She was just sharing that, Eric, you have a bit of an affinity for and a bit of a history buff in you for many things, but not least of which, just broadly speaking, the history of credit.
Yeah, call me crazy, but I have been in the consumer reporting industry for 29 years. Let's round down from 30. So almost 3 decades. I've been in the consumer reporting industry representing consumer reporting agencies of all shapes and sizes, from the biggest of the big 3 nationwide credit bureaus to some very small consumer reporting agencies. There's a lot of people who think that there's only 3 nationwide, but there's only 3 consumer reporting agencies out there, and there are 3 nationwide credit bureaus, but there's many, many other consumer reporting agencies. We at NCRA represent many of them. Our members are tenant screening companies that do credit, criminal, and eviction checks for landlords and property managers to help them manage risk, to help keep their buildings safe. And we represent mortgage reporting companies, which are companies that provide credit information from Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. We obtain the credit reports from those 3. We merge them together in what is commonly known as a tri-merge credit report, and we sell it out into the mortgage marketplace under the FCRA permissible purposes requirements. So all of our members open doors to consumers, whether it's the home buying process or the home rental process. So being in this industry as long as I have developed an affinity for deep arcana knowledge of the American credit reporting, the American consumer reporting system. Call me crazy, but there it is.
Listen, I love it. There is so many little aspects of history that are fun to think about. And there's really nothing more, when you think about it, there's really not too many things more important that, particularly in America, than credit. And that all runs on the ability of our members, the consumer credit companies that are providing vehicles and homes and all of the other and traditional installment loans, all of those other things to consumers. And they rely every single day on the services and products that the folks at NCRA provide.
Yeah, absolutely. The consumer reporting industry are really the unsung heroes of the American credit reporting system. And all of our members and the big 3 nationwide credit bureaus all work behind the scenes to have a fast, efficient, reliable, accurate consumer reporting system without which the American credit economy could not exist. If you did away with the American credit reporting system, like perhaps some consumer advocates have suggested, and nationalized the system, that would probably last about a day. And if the American credit reporting system didn't exist, you would have to invent it. If you are refinancing your home at 3 o'clock in the morning in your pajamas, or you're buying a car online late at night, banks are closed, you can't get a hold of a bank, how are you going to get a loan? Well, you could do a lot of this online. And the working behind the scenes, guided by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which I suspect we'll get into as well in this conversation, are our members that are providing the accurate, reliable data to complete those transactions, to get your car loans, your student loans, a HELOC to meet any of your credit needs, including credit emergencies. Your basement is flooded and you need a new washer and dryer immediately. You need new credit to pay for the people that are coming in to do the mitigation, the water and mold mitigation and things like that. So the unsung heroes, bottom line, the credit reporting industry are the unsung heroes of the American credit reporting system.
Yeah. And so this is a good transition to kind of think about, let's go back a little bit, and not a little bit. If you go back, you're going to have to go back quite a bit about the idea of credit. And I'm pulling out now my 101 classes in Latin way back when. The term credit there, it means trust in English. So, this starts of years ago, right? Not just modern banks and credit scores, but we're talking, the ancient world when we talk about the history of credit.
Yeah. So we can go back thousands of years, but then I'll come back and go backward only just a couple of centuries. I feel like we should insert some music in post-production that creates a kind of a way back time machine.
You got it.
I don't know what that music would be, but there it is. So the most basic question you want to know if somebody comes to you to borrow some money, and let's say in modern times, somebody's asking you to borrow $50. Ancient times, they're asking you whatever the commercial money of exchange was, whether it's a stone with a circle in it with the emperor stamp on it or something like that. The most important thing you want to know if somebody comes to you and says, hey, can I borrow X, whatever X is, whatever that currency is are you going to pay me back? And when are you going to pay me back? And so how do you know? In the olden days, when people were far less mobile and society was much smaller and more compact, it was relatively easy for the lender to understand the risk because the lender knew the person, likely knew the family, likely knew the parents and the cousins and the aunts and uncles. And they knew does this person have some method of commercial enterprise that they will ultimately be able to pay me back in full and in whatever time allotted. So now let's move forward thousands of years. So let's talk about maybe colonial America, appropriate enough perhaps on the 250th anniversary of the founding of the country. The American credit reporting system really has its roots in colonial times. And so even though Americans were, or what would become known as Americans, were still relatively compact, there was enough trade going on. Well, let me back up a step, because the American credit reporting system has its roots in the retail community, which makes a lot of sense because when you're walking into your local retailer in, let's call it 1770, and you need to buy flour and you need to buy feed for your animals, maybe you need some other dry goods, some soap and things like that, and you were buying this on credit, well, the merchant would make a note in his, and most of the time it was in his ledger that Eric Ellman comes in for feed and flour and soap, and the whole thing costs whatever the unit of currency at the time was, whether it was pounds or some other pieces of eight or whatever the mode of currency was, and there were different colonial forms of exchange. So the clerk would make a note that this much paid in cash, this much paid by credit, and the clerk would just keep a running record. And sometimes it was a ledger book, probably sometimes on maybe the early equivalent of index cards. So that was really the earliest origins. And as the country grew, credit reporting was still very prominently run at a merchant-based system. Think about Sears credit cards and JCPenney cards for back when retailers actually had credit and then ultimately credit cards. And I'm jumping back between centuries and decades here. So the credit reporting system ultimately evolved because the American society became more mobile. So let's follow this example further. So you have a customer in New York who goes in to his merchant in New York for, again, the feed and the flour and the soap and whatever other dry goods. And now this particular consumer happens to be going from New York to Philadelphia to conduct business and now wants to acquire merchandise at a store in Philadelphia. Well, the Philadelphia clerk at the store has no idea who this person is who just walked in the door. So what does this person do? This person might write a letter on quill pen on a piece of paper and send it via Pony Express or whatever passed for mail at that time, letter back to the merchant in New York and says, hey, Eric Ellman has walked into my store in Philadelphia. I don't know who this person is, but he tells me that you have done business with him and his family for years. Is this person a good credit risk or not? So that letter might take a week, and then a response from the merchant in New York would say, Eric Ellman, I know him, I know his family, all good people. He pays his debts on time. He is a good credit risk. And that letter might take another week to get back from New York to Philadelphia. And then 2 weeks later, the customer would maybe walk back into the store and say, hey, you now have a good, clean credit history from your merchant in New York. Here are the goods that I'm willing to extend to you on credit. Slow. It was fast and efficient and novel at the time, but it would never work today.
Right.
That is some of the earliest origins of the American credit reporting system.
That's interesting. You touched on a really good point there, because I think it ties very closely back. Just another example of how both the history and current historical members of the credit reporting agency and landscape and NCRA members link back very strongly to AFSA members. The traditional installment lenders, the reason they've been so successful and have been so important to their communities is because they still do much of this personal. They do know the folks down the street, the farmer down the street that's taking out credit to fix the crop duster and the tractor and all that kind of information. We've got all this kind of equipment. We've got members that have been lending to the same family now for like 5 generations.
Right.
So, but to your point, that only goes so far. And so we kind of have this development of broader and more national credit reporting, historical credit reporting, but it still is. So when does that start to coalesce? If I'm going from New York to Philadelphia, that works. But let's say I'm heading out west and finally making the big move, but I still want to bring the credit with me. I've been a good consumer to my local grocer in Philadelphia. When does that start to make its way into a broader space?
Yeah, all good questions. The credit reporting system, as I described it to you, where you write a letter from one merchant to another, that still existed in this country until relatively recently. And by relatively recently, I'm talking about maybe the early to middle part of the 20th century. Certainly the credit reporting system, the modern credit reporting system that we know today. And of course, over time, the letter was replaced by the telegraph and the telephone. In fact, one of the great pictures that I have in my archive is the Credit Bureau of Baton Rouge in maybe the 1940s had purchased a bowling alley because it needed a ton of space for all of its filing cabinets with all of its file folders of all of its tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of customers.
Wow.
And the way it worked in the 1940s is that somebody goes to, let's just call it Sears. Somebody goes to Sears and wants to open a credit account right there at Sears, or wants to buy something on credit over an existing account. So what would happen is that the merchant at Sears would pick up the telephone and call and this transaction, and credit reporting at the time was very hyper local. So if you are in the Baton Rouge area, the merchant is going to use the Credit Bureau of Baton Rouge. If you are in Lincoln, Nebraska, any merchants in that area are primarily going to use the Credit Bureau of Lincoln. And when I started in the credit reporting industry almost 30 years ago, there were 1,000 credit bureaus across the country.
Wow.
And now there's much fewer than those, in many respects largely replaced by the 3 nationwide credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. But in the 1940s, for example, so somebody is standing at a Sears in Baton Rouge, picks up the phone, the clerk at Sears calls the Credit Bureau of Baton Rouge, a person on the other end of the phone, usually a woman, says, I have Mr. Jones or Mrs. Jones here at the counter. They're buying, roller skates and a dress and a tie for $5 and they want to put this all on credit. What's their credit risk? So the clerk at the Credit Bureau Baton Rouge would write down the person's name, maybe their address, and then hand it to another person at the credit bureau, again, usually a woman. And at this particular time in this photograph, all of the people in the credit bureau had roller skates, and they would take the ticket with the name and address and they would roller skate to the filing cabinet for J and look in the filing cabinet under Jones, pick out the file, and then this was high tech
Yeah.
back in the day because this was high speed. You could create so much more efficient, timely decisions if somebody's on roller skates versus walking. So you roller skate back to the woman on the phone, they open the file and they read out the credit history from the paper file to the clerk at Sears, and then a decision is made to grant credit or not. That whole process that I just talked about probably is 10, 15 minutes is a very rough guess. Now, of course, this happens in a millisecond. But so getting back to the modern credit reporting system as we know it today really had its origins in the 1950s and 60s, and then certainly significant advances in the 70s, all driven by technology and the advent of computers. And of course, in the 60s and 70s, the servers that we know today took up giant floors of buildings for the computing power that is a fraction of what can be accomplished today. So really the economy of scale, the mobility, the highly mobile American society, and the advent and advances in technology brought us to where we are today, where all of these small regional credit bureaus, when I first started in this industry, were being acquired by the nationwide credit bureau. So the credit bureau of Des Moines might be acquired by Equifax, and the credit bureau of Columbia, Missouri might be acquired by Experian, and the credit bureau of Portland, Oregon might be acquired by TransUnion. So we went very quickly from thousands of credit bureaus to ultimately 3 nationwide credit bureaus. So that really gets us to where we are today. And I want to make sure, because it's important, at some point, let's talk a little bit about the regulation that governs the credit reporting industry, because that's particularly important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually, it was a perfect segue, because, you know, we were talking about the folks that would skate back and forth with the files, and what was in those files is really what started to move us in the direction where regulation might, you know, just consolidating what is in those files. We're having the same debates back then that we are now. But those files could kind of include all sorts of different things, maybe subjective comments, things like that. And that's where I think partially, and you tell me, but partially I think that's where the FCRA came from. The idea where we need to standardize the information that's available to everyone.
Yeah, all correct. So let's talk a little bit about the body of regulation that governs the credit. And it's not just the credit bureaus. The FCRA, which was passed in 1970, became effective in 1971, and has been amended and modernized many, many times over the intervening decades. Was a reaction to a number of things. One, still credit decisions at that time were still very subjective. Even if you were a good credit risk, you could be denied credit because you are a woman, because you are a divorced woman, because you are a single woman. You could be denied because you're Black. You could be denied because you're Jewish. You could be denied because my records, and there were plenty of credit reports at that time that said people had a drinking problem, or he was or she was angry all the time, or they didn't like the way you looked or the way you smelled. They didn't like the car you drove on or the neighborhood you live in. There was so much subjectivity in credit decisions, particularly. So, for example, we're going to talk for just a second about the FCRA, but related to the FCRA are other protections, consumer protection statutes like ECOA, which because for many years, women could not get credit in their own name. So the FCRA and ECOA and other statutes that prohibit discrimination in lending, they all work together. They are all pillars of a system that works very hard to hold businesses accountable to make sure that lending is objective and fair.
Right.
in walks the FCRA in 1970, passed by Congress, like I mentioned, and about half of the states have what we call mini FCRAs, their own state versions of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The FCRA is really the nation's first privacy statute. And a lot of people don't really think about the FCRA as a
Yeah.
privacy statute, but it is. It's also a statute that regulates credit. It regulates, there are really four parties in the FCRA. There's the consumer, everything starts and ends with the consumer. Then there are the regulations in the FCRA cover the what's called the furnishers of the data, which are companies that furnish the data to the consumer reporting agencies. Regulations, significant regulation over the consumer reporting agencies themselves. And then there's regulations on the users of consumer reports. And furnishers and users are often the same people. It's an auto lender that's providing auto payment history to the lender, to the consumer reporting agency. At that stage in the process, you're a furnisher. And then if you are looking at a credit report to make a lending decision, you are a user. So you can be a furnisher and a user. And that's quite common. So the FCRA, as a privacy statute, incorporates all of the what's called the Fair Information Practices, or FIPS: notice, access, choice, a right to correct. And then there's more. We could spend a whole nother podcast on the FCRA. We could probably spend 10 podcasts on the FCRA. But at its core, it's a statute to embolden consumers with significant rights and to require businesses to adhere to significant legal obligations. And all of this works in tandem to create what is really the most efficient, most reliable credit reporting system that the world has ever known.
Yeah.
And the American economy relies on this very desperately.
Absolutely. And you make a good point. It's really a balance, right, between access to information and consumer protection, and ensuring, because at the end of the day, we have to have a fair system like this. Benefits consumers, absolutely. Otherwise we'd be going back to these very subjective things and files that don't help anyone, really. So let me ask you this. This all works around folks that have credit history and things like that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how we might, particularly as today, how you're thinking about consumers that have a thin file or don't have a lot of credit history. What can they be doing, and what are perhaps NCRA members doing when we're thinking about those issues?
Yeah, these are great questions because and I'm glad you asked me this, Dan, because there are so many consumers, too many consumers that are what we would call either thin file or no-hit consumers, meaning that their credit report there's so little information on their credit report to make it very difficult, perhaps impossible to score. And credit scoring drives so many credit decisions these days. And if we have time, we can talk about credit scoring too. And a no-hit is, of course, you've got no credit history at all. Our members, the nationwide credit bureaus, and this is something that's been a passion of mine for a very long time. I spent many years on the board of directors of Credit Builders Alliance, which is a trade association, or an organization, I'd say, a nonprofit organization based in DC that spends all of its time helping consumers across the country build credit where they don't have credit. And maybe they had credit and they lost it. So for example, you've got a woman, and it's usually a woman in this case, who was a victim of financial abuse by a spouse, a partner, or whatever, who ran up tons of debt in her name, wrecked her credit. But also young consumers, or consumers who have significant bills because they were laid off or something like that. There's lots of reasons why people don't have access. I forget the statistic, but it's, I don't know, 20 some odd, 30 some odd million consumers in the US that don't have credit. So here is what our members have been working to do. And a particular shout out to organizations like Credit Builders Alliance, and anyone who's listening who wants to know more about Credit Builders Alliance, Google it, because it's an amazing organization doing amazing things. Our members, the nationwide credit bureaus, are working really hard to bring in to the mainstream system what we would call alternative data. And I would love to get to a point in my lifetime where alternative data is just called data. And by alternative data, we're talking about utility payments like a cell phone bill or water, gas, heat, electricity. Consumers might not have a car loan or a student loan, but also very importantly, rent. There are two, and we could spend yet another whole podcast talking about rent reporting to the credit reporting system. I would love to see much more rental payment data getting reported into the credit reporting system. Landlords have historically been reluctant to do it, but I think landlords are generally making progress in this area. That's a whole nother podcast. And companies, including several of our members, companies like IDIQ, for example, are working very hard to help consumers get data, rental payment history reported directly to the credit bureaus. In case the landlord doesn't report, the consumer can bypass the landlord, working with links between a checking account and
that's great.
and a credit reporting history. So what can consumers do that don't have a credit history? And there's a bit of a catch-22 because you can't get credit if you don't have a credit history. Well, how do you have a credit history if you don't get credit? It's an age-old dilemma. But for consumers who have things like utilities and car payments, to the extent that you do, but other things, which includes rent, and so many consumers are not getting the credit that they deserve because they're making on-time positive rental payment history. There's a lot of businesses working really hard to get that data reported into the system. There are companies that are working hard to allow consumers to self-report that data. Self-reporting has its own challenges because consumers will not likely self-report things that are not in their best interest. So there's a lot of people working really hard to sort out how you can create a good credit risk decision if a consumer is only self-reporting positive rental payment history. It's better than nothing. It's not as good as reporting positive and negative, but it's, I think, a really good start. But it is a significant problem. So many consumers would benefit from having more rental payment history being reported and other payment history. One of the other challenges also with alternative data payments, like let's take utilities, for example, there are actually state statutes or public utility commission rules that sometimes prohibit the reporting of utility data to the credit reporting industry. So sometimes laws get in the way of positive credit reporting history, which is unfortunate, but it is there.
Yeah. And we're starting to get to the end of our time here, but there are 2 points that I wanted to touch on briefly. One is going to be credit scores for sure. But before we move off of this topic, because I think it may play a role here, it's in the water. We have to talk about it. AI. What role might AI have in solving part of the problem that you were addressing, if any? It's such a new technology. It may not have a role yet, but perhaps it does. And what are your thoughts surrounding AI and credit reporting generally?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a whole other podcast right there.
Yeah,
I
know.
There's we've already talked about
now.
nine other podcasts from this
scheduled.
one. I know. There's, how shows have spin-offs and things.
Yeah.
This could be the beginning of a spin-off series.
Dan and Eric talk credit reporting. I love it. I think
I'm in,
works.
100% on board with that.
We'll get Celia on here. It'll be great.
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Well, AI, the term AI is obviously very new. Yes. And things like agentic AI and all of that, machine learning, these are all relatively new terms, but the technology that grounds AI is not really new at all. It's really, AI is just automated decision making. And credit scores are which date back to the 1950s, 60s, those were automated decisions based upon algorithms, and we still have those algorithms today. Obviously, they're more advanced and all legally compliant, but AI can have a significant positive impact in the consumer reporting system by improving matching technology and in terms of identity management, because this is, we know, a very mobile society. People get married, they get divorced, they are adopted, they change their names and things like that. And matching identity verification and authentication and fraud prevention are mission critical in the consumer reporting system. So AI can do a lot to help manage data identity to make sure that Dan Buscherer am I pronouncing that correctly? Is the same Dan Buscherer applicant to credit history. Also importantly, AI is making it easier to commit fraud. And the good guys, your members, our members, others, are in this constant cat and mouse game to build a better mousetrap. So the deep fakes and the fraud are getting harder to spot. And so the business community has to respond in kind to use automated technology like AI to help keep up with all of that. And then lastly, AI can be really helpful, going back to our discussion, Dan, about the underserved or the unbanked or the underbanked, in working far and wide to get as much rich information as we can about a largely unknown person to help determine that person's credit risk.
That's very interesting. We have a number of business partners, vendors of ours that are starting to use AI in a responsible way to develop that kind of thing. And I'm sure you do too. So it's a very interesting field. We'll see where we end up with it. I'm sure as we make our way through the AI history here, that our members will come up with some very interesting ways to help consumers as well. Before I let you go, I did want to, because you mentioned it, and it's a piece that we didn't mention when we were talking about credit reports broadly, but credit scores. Everybody's at this number. It's there. You're always thinking about that number. When you go to the auto dealer down the street, you're like, even if you know that you have a good grasp on your finances and things, you know that it's pretty good, but you're still like, I don't know. Talk to me a little bit about the credit score, and just, the obviously we talked about how it's a good snapshot, a good way for a lender to look at a consumer. But give a little brief history on the credit score and a little bit about how your members are using it nowadays.
Yeah, well, let's go back again into our Wayback Time Machine, because in the right there it is.
I'll insert it. That wasn't good.
No, I like that. That was good. In going back in our Wayback Time Machine, in the olden days, and by olden days, I'm talking about like the 90s and 60s and before, credit decisions, and even in the 70s, credit decisions were made by a human being, by a person. And that person comes with a whole lot of known and unknown biases. And they are making very subjective decisions. They are looking at the credit history, like we talked about, but they are also factoring in things like, oh, this is a divorced woman. This is an African American. This person is Jewish. This person comes from the wrong side of town. This person did not go to college. The technology that was pioneered in the 1950s by Mr. Isaac, that ultimately gave birth to what we now know as FICO, Fair Isaac, took all of that subjectivity out and based credit decisions just based on your credit history itself. It didn't care about the color of your skin. It didn't care about your religion. It didn't care whether you belonged to the right country club or you didn't belong to a country club at all. They're fair, objective decisions based just on the numbers. And that's really one of the great benefits of technology. Not only does it create an objective decisioning tool, going back to our conversation about automated decisioning, but it also does so in a very fast period of time. A loan that used to take, a car loan, for example, that used to take a day or two to process, now, as you and I both know, and certainly many of your listeners in the auto loan business know, that you walk into a dealership and boom, you're approved while you're sitting there while your coffee is still hot. You're approved for a loan and hopefully at the rate that you want. A lot of people talk about, oh, my score is this or my score is that. The way I look at, and people ask me all the time, how could I improve my score? What can I do, et cetera? The single best piece of advice to improve or to maintain a good credit score is to pay your bills on time, over time. Easier said than done sometimes. But that's really at its core. And ultimately, if you get the product you want at the rate you want, that should be the win.
Definitely. That's a perfect note on which to perhaps wrap up this episode, but tease our 15-part miniseries coming.
Credit with Eric and Dan.
Yeah, I think I'm really quite serious. I think we're going to make this happen.
Gosh, Dan, this has been so much fun. I could talk about this all day long, and I'm glad that we have 14 more podcasts on which to do that. Thank you so much to you and for Team AFSA for having me. I love it.
Well, Eric Ellman, president of the National Consumer Reporting Association, NCRA, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Dan.